Hey kids, tell me 2 countries which you wouldn't want to live in. There's a high chance that you chose 2 countries in the Korean peninsula, North and South Korea. They have the same culture, geography, history? How could they be split up? Well, say hello to... The Koreas are situated in a peninsula sticking out of China, containing 2 countries. The Republic of Korea, aka South Korea, known for tech, League of Legends, and most importantly, K-pop. While its insane twin, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is known for nukes, human rights, the lack thereof, and did I almost forget it being an insane totalitarian communist dictatorship, or just North Korea for short. So how come one is one of the richest countries in the world and the other one is literally dirt poor and starving to death? It couldn't be from their geography, can it? They're literally on the same peninsula. Well, no, but we have to give some credit to geography. But we can give most of the credit to history. We have to go far, far back when Korea was somewhat independent. At this point in time, Korea, the Joseon dynasty, was an isolated vassal of the Ming dynasty. And knock knock, who's there? Oh my god, it's Japan trying to invade Korea. But don't worry, we got the Ming dynasty to help us, acting like 2 of their puppet states weren't attacking each other. They repelled the invasion and making Korea even more isolationist, and it stagnated. And an important note about Korea, when it takes an ideology, it takes it on steroids. If China was only allowing trading, Korea would be absolutely unreachable, just like her dad. Skip forward 2 centuries, Korea was the same little isolationist state, and also became a hermit kingdom, the first of its kind ever. But Japan came with its guns and boats and forced Korea to open some ports, and ended Korea's Chinese protectorate status with an unfair treaty using gunboat diplomacy. But don't think Japan was done yet. Japan came back bigger, better, and stronger, and they wanted this island Gangwon, the main fortification of Seoul. Joseon lost, and after a couple of revolutions and protests later, the Korean Empire was formed. Wait, what's that? Holy crap, Japan just wiped the floor with Russia, and then Korea independently signed a protectorate treaty with Japan in 1905, and then Japan made them a colony in 1910. As you might know, people don't like getting ruled over a foreign power very much. So what did the Koreans do? Well, they revolted of course, but that didn't stop the Japanese from brutally beating down on dissent. The Japanese ruled Korea with an iron fist, making Japanese Korea a police state. But how can you maintain such a colony without Japanese people, you might ask? Well, 170,000 Japanese people moved into Korea, seeking opportunity that included agriculture and industry. Well, where did they put these industries, you might ask? The south had more arable land, so most of the food production was centered there. And north having more natural resources, that fueled their factories and the industry. Oh, but don't think that Korea got to keep its natural resources though. No, because World War II was the next cool kids thing, and Japan and its friends were in on the action. But this video isn't about World War II though, so we'll just skip over that. What now about the Koreans? How did the Japanese treat them? Since, well, they kinda colonized their whole country and well, to say badly would be kind of an understatement. That's like saying there's a drop of water in the ocean. So what did the Japanese do? Well, they deprived Koreans from their freedom from assembly, the press and speech, and every other single freedom you can think of that was deprived from them. Then they replaced every Korean in parliament with a Japanese person, forced Koreans to work in factories, drafted them to war, destroyed their shrines and temples, Korean history was banned in schools, and were forced to worship Japanese Shinto shrines and revere the emperor, and then they raped tens of thousands of their women. Gives you a piece of how evil-spirited Imperial Japan was. And this isn't even listing their other atrocities in other occupied territories. But don't think that the Koreans were just complacent and just stood there. They fought against the Japanese mainly in Manchuria and Burma. Some were trained by American military men to fight against the Japanese. Oh, what a dump. I hate this world. I wish something would happen. Yep, the United States just dropped 2 nukes on Japan, making them surrender and marking the end of the Second World War. All of Japan's occupied territories were returned to their pre-war overlords. But wait, what will they do with Korea? It was agreed upon that Korea was to be placed under an international trusteeship until the Koreans were deemed fit to rule themselves. But in the final days of the war, the United States proposed a plan to split Korea between North and South by the 48th parallel. and it was supposed to be a temporary solution, but there is nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. So the North was to be temporarily managed by the Soviet Union, and the South to be managed by the Americans. The Soviets set up a provisional government called the Provisional People's Committee under leadership of Kim Il-sung, who also served as a Soviet soldier. While South Korea had a democratic election, with an American-backed Seung-min Rhee winning 92.3% of the votes. But don't get fooled though, these are both ruthless dictators. Rhee allowed his internal security, led by his right-hand man, Kim Chang-ron, to detain and torture suspected communists and North Korean agents. Kim Il-sung practically did the same, but with the roles reversed. At this time in the 1950s, North Korea was way better off than the South, with aid from the Soviet Union, and with that being able to industrialize, mainly exporting locomotives, synthetics, machine tools, and chemical fertilizers, mainly to the Soviet Union and China. Meanwhile, the South was quite poor. After World War II and Japanese occupation, it was basically left for dead by the Americans, since it had no strategic value to them, which was a grave mistake. The South established themselves as the First Republic of Korea, and this new republic was quite unstable. Rhee was a ruthless dictator, and he betrayed his own party, with giving them no seats in government, and then his own party revolted, and then he started his own party, and then they, the people he backstabbed, started their own party, and then Rhee brutally crushed them down. And also not to mention with the fact that there were North Korean supported communist protests in Jeju and whatever this region is called, which he also brutally suppressed. Hello, Stalin speaking. Yo, it's me, your boy, Kim Il-sung. Oh my god, not this dipshit again. So like, I want to invade South Korea. Ask China. If they say yes, I'll allow you to. Oh my god, what is it? I want to invade South Korea. Oh, yeah? China said yes. Have some guns and supplies. So that's pretty much how the Korean War started. On June 25, 1950, 135,000 DPRK soldiers crossed the South Korean border. The objective was to militarily conquer South Korea and unifying the peninsula. In 3 days, they captured the South Korean capital of Seoul, and on the start of July, American soldiers landed on Korea. Not long later, Incheon would fall to the NKPA, and after the fall of Incheon, South Korean cities would fall like dominoes. Osan, Chochiwon, Daegon, Jinju? At this point, the South Koreans and Americans were effectively cornered to Busan, and they set up an offensive perimeter. The war was in a stalemate. But the Americans launched a surprise landing at Incheon, another going northeast to liberate Seoul, and then they started an offensive outside the Busan perimeter, another liberating Seoul. On the start of October, the ROK crossed the 38th parallel. They captured Wonsan, and the week after, captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. The US continued the march through Unsan, and they landed at Iwon. The ROK has almost won the war. But what's that? The Chinese sent 250,000 soldiers to help the North push back. They liberate Wonsan, Pyongyang, and eventually start crossing the 40th parallel, and closing it to Seoul and capturing it. The Americans abandoned Incheon. The South pushes the North back and crosses the border. The North Koreans push the South back again, and then the South pushed back again, and they ended in a stalemate. Saying no end to the war, both sides signed the Korean armistice. Though this did not officially end the war, it ended the fighting. What was the point? Nobody gained anything, just because some people wanted something their way. 5 million people dead, 3 million of them being civilians. So, how were the Koreas after the war? Well, they were absolutely war-torn and crippled, so how did they bounce back? Let's look at the North's development. They had the Soviets and Chinese to help their development. North Korea was left with half of its industry gone, and a quarter of its agricultural production, 3/4 of its housing destroyed, and every single other sector experienced a similar detrimental decline. North Korea suffered around $130 million in damages, or about $2 billion in today's money. North Korea mainly relied on aid from other communist countries, and by then it made a third of their economy. And using that money, about $10 billion of today's money, from China alone for reconstruction, North Korea mainly relied on aid from other communist countries. By then it made a third of their economy, and using that money, about $10 billion of today's money from China alone for reconstruction, China was in a bad state, but they volunteered free labor to help the North. North Korea brought Chinese and Soviet experts to come and redesign their country. New houses were built, bridges connected, dams constructed. Now that North Korea had some stability, they could start a 3-year plan with support from China and the Soviet Union. But realize how I mentioned so much on China and the Soviet Union? Well, the North Korean populace themselves were kinda angry since none of them had jobs. So what did Kim Il-sung do? Just like any good dictator, he just blamed someone else, of course. Who would he blame? People from his cabinet, his party, even his own delegate to the Moscow party, and some guerrilla groups. And he quoted that, "Neither the Soviet Union nor China would help us forever. We must get prepared to deal with our difficulties." Basically saying they don't need no power. And he founded the Juche ideology. So, what is Juche? You can call it a quasi-religion, a nationalist ideology, or a deviation from Marxist-Leninism. You'd be partially right. It's basically an ideal, a policy for self-reliance, independence, and also self-defense to make North Korea completely self-dependent. They don't need no power. And Kim Il-sung might have made a cult of personality, but back to that later. It was first used to lower Chinese and Soviet influence, and to raise Korean nationalism, and to solidify his grip on North Korea. Most of the 1950s to 60s were mostly just China and the Soviet Union giving aid to North Korea for reconstruction, and not much else. So let's see how the South is doing. It's war-torn, broken, civil unrest, and not to mention that it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was plagued with crippling corruption, turmoil, and lackluster economic growth. And it didn't help that Rhee was a power-hungry dictator that used any means to hold on to power. But the civilians didn't support that with the slow economic growth. But that didn't stop Rhee from pushing through a security law to make it easier to crack down on dissent and executing political rivals in the name of securing national security. In 1960, Rhee ran for a 4th time and won in a rigged election, which triggered a student-led uprising in April that resulted in his exile to Hawaii. Following the revolution, the South experimented with a more democratic government. Later that year, they made a new constitution and made a parliamentary cabinet, which would place the prime minister as the head of government. And so the Second Republic of Korea was born. But nothing really changed. It suffered from strikes and protests, with them demanding better wages and conditions. But the most important thing was that they devaluated the won, which led to double-digit inflation, further worsening workers' wages. There was an impression that the government just couldn't establish any stability or order. Some political groups advocated for negotiations with Pyongyang and the expulsion of American forces in the country. And there was a fear that the North would just come invading again. And in the middle of this chaos, a military group rose up and overthrew the government after a year of the Second Republic with a certain Park Chung-hee. Under the Rhee and Chang Myon administrations, the economy grew at a sluggishly slow rate, which averaged around 4% a year and less than 2% per capita, of a high birth rate of about 6 kids per woman, and any growth there was funded by American aid, with America funding its government, budget, and military to keep the country from running out of money. For the whole 30-year period, the USA poured in $12.6 billion in aid, just below Israel and South Vietnam. Yeah, it was dirt poor. The Americans saw them as a rat hole eating up aid without making any sustained growth. So what did the Koreans do? When Rhee was in power, he blocked all imports to prop up domestic growth. But that was a horrible idea, considering that South Korea had no natural resources. That just made them more dependent on US imports and US aid, which caused a vicious cycle. Park's administration was frustrated with their situation, since they were a dirt poor country in a booming region. Park did not want the South to take Japanese aid, fearing Japanese dominance again. They would have had to be sucked up into another nation, being sucked up into the Japanese, Chinese, or Soviet spheres. And they would stop that at all costs. So, the South Koreans went to the board, and they started laying a foundation for a South Korean miracle, As riddled with greedy, corrupt officials it also had skilled economists and engineers, which received US and Korean education. Though this was a small to medium portion of the population, this gave a huge boost and gave Korea a well-based educated class to start off with. And as Korea started adopting Japanese-styled economics of state-controlled capitalism, while large family-owned business conglomerates dominated the economy. These conglomerates were called chaebols, and there emerged 3 of them: Hyundai, LG, and Samsung. They're the big dogs of Korea. But back to those later. Let's look at what's happening north of the border. Ooh, what's that? Oh my god, they just developed nuclear weapons after pulling out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They allowed UN inspectors, they found no nukes, but turned out that was a complete lie. Tensions got so bad that America started planning an invasion of North Korea. And to add to all the chaos, Kim Il-sung died later the same year. So Americans sent ships from the Persian Gulf to Korea and the Western Pacific. But before tensions would go too far, they signed an agreed framework in Geneva that would effectively freeze the DPRK's nuclear program. But a decade later, they resumed their nuclear program, accusing America of playing favorites with Iran. So what about the new leader, since Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack? Well, a new Kim Jong-il became the heir of the new presidency. He was an incompetent leader. He had no idea how to run an economy. And it didn't help that there was a severe flood, which started a famine that killed 3 million people. Added with poor land management, and with the fact that only 18% of North Korea's land is arable, that led to North Korea's economy being damaged severely. Just look at the food production. When it came to power, about a 73% decrease. And in 1996, it adopted a military-first policy to help strengthen the country's military, which led to some sort of growth. But that didn't last for long though, and made Korea reliant on foreign aid for food. Kim started a cult of personality, propaganda camp, and started violating the little human rights there were, with having about 200,000 political prisoners in concentration camps. But his rule would be short-lived though, because he would die from a heart attack. I guess it runs in the family, huh? In 2011, and Kim Jong-un would rise to power. But back to the Kim dynasty later. Let's look across the DMZ. Oh my god, South Korea developed into a capitalist utopia. So how did they rise? Back to the chaebols. The South Korean government gave lucrative deals of manufacturing of goods to the conglomerates. They had to fund pro-government campaigns. This support was more about economic targets than political ones. The government didn't allow monopolies, but instead promoted chaebols to work in different industries. And corruption was not tolerated at all. And if you slacked, you were kicked out. So they were the ones mainly sparking innovation. The successful ones grew to 3.5 times higher than the GDP per capita, and most of them expanded into other industries, away from their main business. So let's look at a couple of chaebols then. Samsung. They make your phones, tablets, monitors, TVs, and so much more. Hyundai has cars. LG makes the same thing that Samsung does, but with vacuums and blenders. These companies weren't supposed to compete in Korea though, but to go ship their products to international markets. And oh god, did these companies make South Korea bank! This helped Korea to go from a rural society to an urban one, with an 80% of people living in cities. And with the birth rate plummeting from 6 kids per woman, from going below replacement levels, even going below 1 at the dawn of the 21st century, and helped with healthcare, increasing life expectancy from 50 to 80, which and that means more and more old people. You can't really have kids when you live in a boxed apartment. And Korea will soon face a crisis with its population pyramid, looking like this. Look at the bottom. There are no kids to replace the working class. Old people don't invest in new things, since living for decades seeing their investments can be wiped in mere days, and decide to invest on old people things like bonds, while young people invest on cool things like Robux and NFTs. But there is a back end of relying on mega conglomerates for your economy. They pretty much control South Korea. Samsung controls almost 20% of South Korea's economy, and if you add other chaebols, it is almost 80%. So, now let's go to the modern times. Let's look at North Korea. Oh my god, look at their military, a size of over 1.2 million soldiers. But their economy is absolutely They're isolated from the rest of the world, and they don't fairly treat their citizens the best. Meanwhile, South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world, and is one of the 4 Asian tigers, and is now a leading manufacturer of electronics. But importing everything has a back end, since yeah, they're absolutely screwed on whatever bull is happening in the Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, or Southeast Asia. And it doesn't help that they only trade through water, so that makes the situation 10 times worse. And if you're young, you're paying for everything. Also, you have to study 12 to 16 hours a day. All this stress, let me just look at the night sky and look at some planes and random objects to clear my mind. Lately, South Korea has been going through countless corruption scandals with their chaebols. And with the new president, Moon Jae-in, he's been trying to make a peace deal with North Korea for his whole presidential term and trying to achieve unity, even if that means putting the South in a worse position, like destructing defense, lifting economic sanctions, and then pretty much getting psyched and played. All this makes North Korea get a better position to invade the South again, but there's a very slim chance of that happening, considering that there are over 30,000 American soldiers in the South, or else they would have no leverage in negotiations, and thanks to the fact if the DPRK collapses, there would be millions of Korean refugees fleeing to China, so China keeps them alive, not wanting an American ally right on their doorstep. A lot of friends which they don't have right now, and would block them off in a heartbeat. North Korea saw what happened to Syria and Libya when they started their own nuclear weapons program, so North Korea won't be giving up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. Well, will Korea ever achieve peace and unity? Probably not. If the Koreans go into the future alone, their independence is gone! Their economy, gone! K-pop, gone! And they will be sucked up into another nation's sphere. But until then, we'll just have to wait for— oh my god!